Healing Through Love, a journey of rediscovery and self-acceptance. Before everything unraveled, before the silence thickened like smoke in a sealed room, before the shadows stretched longer between us than the miles of road we once dreamed of driving together, there was a version of us that danced barefoot in the kitchen. We were 23, stupidly hopeful, still believing that love alone could stitch up every wound the world would tear open. That version of us had no idea how easy it was to confuse effort with emotion, comfort with connection, routine with romance. I suppose that's how most slow fades begin. Not with a scream or a slam of the door, but with a forgotten goodnight, a missed text, a smile that hesitates just a second too long. We were never the type to fight, not really. We prided ourselves on calm conversations, on gentle nods, on solving problems like grown-ups. But the truth was, some wounds don't need voices raised, they just need enough time to fester. And in our silence, everything grew. Distance. And one day, without realizing it, we became polite strangers in shared photographs. But let me not get ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the moment when everything was still possible. We met on a Wednesday that felt like a Sunday. I remember that because the air was unusually warm for October, and I had just skipped a meeting to go to a bookstore, a reckless little decision that felt like self-care. He was there, crouched in the corner aisle, pulling out a copy of The Bell Jar. His eyebrows furrowed like the words personally betrayed him. I didn't speak to him. Not then. But I remember thinking, here is someone who reads sadness like scripture. 2 weeks later, we met again. This time in a cafe I rarely visited, where he was laughing too loudly with friends, and I was nursing a heartbreak I didn't talk about. He smiled at me like he'd known me in another life. That was our beginning. Messy, unplanned, magic in a shoebox, if you will. The kind of connection that doesn't ask for permission before crawling into your bones. It was the way he spoke that drew me in. Not the voice, but the pauses. Like every word fought its way out, cautious but sincere. I fell for the quietness of him, for the way he never filled silence just to escape it. We talked until the cafe closed, walked until our legs ached, and kissed in the kind of rain that didn't need thunder to be remembered. The first few months were filled with cliches that we made our own, picnics with spilled wine, arguments over movie endings, long drives to nowhere with playlists that were curated like sacred rituals. We told each other everything, or so we thought. He shared childhood stories like confessions, as if they were crimes, and I listened like a priest behind a curtain. I gave him pieces of myself in metaphors, not always brave enough to be literal. He understood. That's how it was. Until it wasn't. There's no exact day I can point to, no moment where I can say, this is when the decay started. That's the thing about emotional distance. It's invisible until it isn't. One morning, he stopped making coffee for both of us. It sounds trivial, I know. But for 2 years, he had always poured 2 cups, even if I was still asleep. That day, there was only one. It sat smugly on the counter while I stood in the doorway pretending not to notice. That single cup said more than any argument ever could. Still, we brushed it off. I made my own coffee. I kissed his shoulder. We talked about work, life, bills. We pretended the house wasn't colder. We kept living like everything was fine, because admitting otherwise meant opening doors we had carefully kept locked. The next signs were subtle, cruel in their banality. He stopped asking about my dreams, and I stopped writing them down. He came home later, stayed out longer, and I filled the empty hours with distractions dressed as hobbies. We were both tired, we said. Stressed. Just a phase. We both believed it. At least I think we did. Sometimes I wonder if he was waiting for me to notice, to say something to fight. But I didn't, and neither did he. One evening, I found an old photo of us. It was taken a year into our relationship, blurry and poorly lit, both of us laughing, leaning into each other like the world outside didn't matter. I stared at it for hours, trying to remember what that version of us felt like. I couldn't. I knew what we looked like, where we were, even what we wore. But I couldn't recall how it felt to be that happy, That terrified me. I placed the photo back in the drawer and said nothing. We had long stopped sharing small discoveries, the tiny things that once made us smile. New music, strange dreams, the shape of clouds, became private again. It was as if we had become guests in each other's worlds, careful not to touch too much, not to disturb. There was no affair, no betrayal, just a quiet surrender, a giving up disguised as growing up. We convinced ourselves we were just busy, just evolving, but really we were drifting, untethered and too polite to scream. Sometimes love doesn't explode, it dissolves, and that's what ours did. Tragically, beautifully. We still had moments, of course, fleeting bursts of what once was a shared joke, a lazy Sunday, a touch that lingered, but they felt like echoes, and echoes can't build futures. They only remind you of what used to be. He once told me that the saddest part of losing someone isn't the goodbye. It's realizing how long ago you actually lost them. That sentence stayed with me, haunted me, because even as we shared the same bed, the same meals, the same air, we were already gone. I tried, in my own ways. I left notes in his jacket pocket. I cooked his favorite meals. I wore the perfume he once said reminded him of Paris. But nothing stuck. Nothing stirred. It was like trying to wake someone from a dream they didn't want to leave. One night, I asked him if he still loved me. Not because I doubted it, but because I needed to hear something, anything, that proved we were still real. He looked at me, eyes tired, heart elsewhere, and said, "Of course I do." But the way he said it felt like an obligation, not a confession. And I think that was the real end. Not the words, but the weight behind them. We kept going after that, because endings aren't always final. Sometimes they stretch for months, even years. We became experts in pretending. Family gatherings, social media posts, smiles that fooled everyone but us, until one morning I woke up and realized I hadn't dreamed about him in weeks. Not once. That used to be unthinkable. I stared at his sleeping form, memorized the curve of his back, the way his hair curled at the neck, and I felt nothing. Not love, not hate, just a quiet emptiness, like standing in a house after everything's been moved out. I got up, showered, dressed, and left a note. Not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't do it face to face. Because I knew he'd try to make it okay, and I was too tired to pretend. The note was simple. I miss who we used to be, but I don't know how to find us again. I didn't pack much, just a few clothes, a toothbrush, and the photo from the drawer. I walked out of our apartment and into a life I hadn't planned. A life without him. The first days were unbearable. I kept reaching for my phone, expecting his messages. I kept waking up at 2 a.m., thinking I heard his voice. But time is a cruel healer. It doesn't care about your pace. It just keeps moving. Eventually, the pain dulled. The memory softened, and I started dreaming again, not of him, but of something new. Something that didn't hurt. That's how I knew I had survived. I loved him. I still do, in the way you love a favorite song you can't listen to anymore. But I had to choose myself. And maybe, just maybe, that's what love really is. Knowing when to hold on and when to let go. The first morning alone was the hardest. The quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt accusatory. Like every creak of the floorboards, every distant car horn, every bird outside the window was reminding me I had left something behind. Not just a man, not just a life, but a version of myself I no longer believed in. I sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, in a room I had borrowed from an old friend who hadn't asked too many questions. That was the thing about people who've been through their own versions of loss. They don't prod. They offer space, silence, and tea. I remember holding the cup with trembling hands, staring into the steam like it held answers, but all it reflected was my own uncertainty. The days bled into one another. I walked for hours with no destination, as if the motion itself could shake loose the guilt clinging to my ribs. I watched strangers in parks, couples with fingers intertwined, children laughing as if joy was the only language they knew. It didn't make me bitter. It made me nostalgic for a time when I believed happiness was a constant, not a fleeting visitor. I didn't cry as much as I thought I would. Instead, I felt hollow, as if the act of leaving had drained something essential from me. But in that emptiness, there was also clarity. I began to notice things again. The way sunlight pooled on the floor, the scent of rain on warm pavement, the sound of my own breath at night, steady and present. I was still here, still alive, still capable of rebuilding. He didn't call, not right away. And when he finally did, the name on my screen felt foreign. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to hear his voice wrapped in confusion or pain or worse. Apathy. I needed to believe I had done the right thing, even if it hurt. Especially because it hurt. We had built a life together, yes. But it had become a life filled with silent compromises, with unspoken sadness, with days that passed without meaning. I wasn't angry at him. I wasn't even angry at myself. I just knew that staying would have been a betrayal of the person I was becoming. I found a small apartment 3 weeks later. Nothing fancy, a one-bedroom with creaky floors and water that took too long to heat. But it was mine. I bought a second-hand couch, mismatched dishes, and a tiny plant I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep alive. Every piece of it felt like a small act of rebellion against the life I had walked away from. I didn't decorate with framed photos or souvenirs from a past I was trying to untangle. I kept things simple, bare even, like I needed to hear my own thoughts echo through the space. I started working at a bookstore, not because it paid well, but because it felt poetic. Full circle, almost. The same kind of store where I had first seen him years ago, crouched in that aisle with the tortured expression. I didn't tell anyone there about him, about us. It felt too sacred to share, too fragile to reduce to anecdotes or summaries. Instead, I shelved books, recommended titles I loved, and found strange comfort in the smell of paper and ink. It was quiet work, healing work. Then came the letters. The first one arrived with no return address, no name. Just my own handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a single page. Do you ever think about the first time we danced in the rain? That was it. No greeting, no signature. But I knew it was him. I knew because no one else would remember that. No one else would describe it as dancing. It had been chaotic, unplanned. Us running down the street in a storm, soaked and laughing and reckless. A moment we had never captured in a photo, never even told anyone about. But it had lived in both of us. And now it was trying to live again. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because I didn't know what to say. Was this a beginning? A trap? A ghost refusing to rest? 2 weeks later, another envelope. This time I still make 2 cups of coffee out of habit. One always gets cold. That one made me cry. I had imagined him angry, confused, relieved. But not this. Not sad. Not soft. We had both failed each other in different ways. But somehow, through these letters, he was trying to speak a language we had forgotten in our final months together. I began collecting them, not displaying them, not rereading them obsessively, just keeping them. A small wooden box under my bed. It felt like a conversation that neither of us was brave enough to have out loud, but both of us still needed. He never asked for me to come back. Never begged. He just reminded me of who we were when we believed in us. And maybe that was more powerful than any plea. The hardest letter came in early spring. I saw someone today who looked like you. For a moment, I let myself believe it was. She smiled. You used to smile like that before you stopped. It broke me. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. I had stopped smiling. Somewhere between the routine and the silence, between the shared dinners that felt like appointments and the kisses that felt like punctuation, I had stopped feeling light. I had carried the weight of trying to fix something that neither of us had words for. And maybe in doing so, I had buried my joy so deep that even he couldn't find it anymore. I wrote back, just one line, I want to smile like that again. I didn't expect a reply. But I hoped. Instead, weeks passed. Then months. The letters stopped. The silence returned, not from him this time, but from the universe. I thought I would feel relief. Closure maybe. But it felt like a door half, shut in a hallway I hadn't finished walking down. I didn't know what I wanted, only that something still lingered between us, like a song stuck on a lyric. waiting to resolve. One morning, I went to the bookstore and saw a man browsing the poetry section. From the back, he looked like him. Same build, same tilt of the head. My heart stuttered. I didn't move. I just watched, hidden behind a display of journals. When he turned, it wasn't him. But the disappointment surprised me. I hadn't realized I'd been hoping. That night, I walked home slower than usual. I passed the cafe we used to visit. It had changed owners, repainted the walls, updated the menu. But the chairs were still red, the windows still steamed from inside. I stood there, half expecting him to appear, laughing at something I'd missed. Of course, he didn't. Life doesn't work that way. I started therapy. Not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand why I had stayed so long in something that had stopped feeling like love. I wanted to understand my silences, my patterns, my fear of hurting someone even if it meant hurting myself more. My therapist was kind, sharp, unafraid to dig. She didn't speak of blame or right and wrong. She spoke of patterns, of unmet needs, of voices swallowed so long we forget what they sound like. I found myself talking about childhood, about watching my parents argue without words, about learning that quiet didn't mean peace. It meant avoidance. And suddenly, everything made sense. My relationship hadn't failed because of one moment. It had failed because I had learned to believe that love meant endurance, not presence. That staying silent was noble. That leaving was weakness. But leaving had been strength, the kind that doesn't come with applause or understanding, the kind that bruises before it heals. Spring turned to summer. My apartment felt lighter. I bought another plant. This one thrived. I hosted a small dinner for new friends from work. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. And one night, as I lay in bed listening to the city outside my window, I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for a letter, not for him, not even for myself to feel whole again. I was whole, just differently shaped. I still think of him sometimes. When I hear a certain song, when I smell a certain cologne, when I pass someone who walks like him, shoulders slightly hunched, always a little ahead as if outrunning thoughts. But it's not painful anymore, just distant. Like looking at an old photo of a city you once loved but no longer live in. You remember the streets, the favorite cafes, the view from your old window. But you also know it's not home anymore. Not in the way it once was. One morning, almost a year to the day since I left, I opened my mailbox and found a final letter. No envelope, no pretense. Just a folded page, worn at the edges. You were right to go. I couldn't see it then, but I do now. I'm learning to smile again, too. Thank you for loving me when it mattered. And for leaving when it mattered more. There was no return address, no name. But there didn't need to be. I folded the letter and placed it in the box under my bed, now full of memories I no longer needed to revisit. And then I went to make myself coffee. 1 cup. Strong. Hot. Enough. That summer unfolded like a long exhale I didn't know I'd been holding in. The heaviness that had once made my chest feel like a locked drawer began to loosen, and with every quiet morning and every small decision I made without compromise, I began to recognize myself again. Not the version molded by a shared life, but someone raw and unfinished, someone real. I started noticing the world differently. It was as if grief had stripped away a layer of film from my eyes. The colors were sharper, the silence less suffocating. I would walk past shop windows and see my reflection, not as the woman who left or the woman who had been left behind emotionally, but simply someone who had survived the middle of her story and was stumbling into whatever came next. The bookstore became more than a job. It was a haven, a place where time slowed and people still believed in the quiet power of paper. I'd watch customers hold books like sacred objects, running fingers along spines, flipping pages as if they might fall in love with a sentence. And I understood that because I had fallen in love with sentences once too. With his. With the letters. With the way he used memories like thread, trying to mend something too torn to be saved. But that was the past now. It lived in a box beneath my bed, not in the corners of my heart. I no longer checked the mailbox with expectation. I no longer paused at every unfamiliar phone number. I had stopped waiting. Then one evening, just as the sky was bleeding into pink and lavender, something shifted again. I met someone. Not dramatically. Not cinematically. No thunderclap of fate. Just a new barista at the coffee shop 2 blocks from my apartment. His name was Oliver, and he made terrible lat art, but remembered my name after one introduction. The first time he handed me my drink, he asked if I was a writer. I laughed and told him no. But later that day, the question lingered in my head. Why had I said no? I used to write, not for others, not for publication, but for myself. Pages of thoughts and observations and long, winded journal entries I'd never let anyone read. Somewhere in the quiet unraveling of my last relationship, I'd stopped. I wasn't sure when or why. But I missed it. That night I bought a new notebook. I didn't write a love story. I didn't write about him. I wrote about the smell of the bookstore when it rained, about the sound of a train in the distance at night, about the first time I danced alone in my apartment and didn't feel foolish. It wasn't profound. It wasn't poetic. But it was mine. Oliver and I kept crossing paths. He had a crooked smile and a way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. But I wasn't looking for anything. Not romance. Not entanglement. I was still learning how to stand still in my own space. Still building the scaffolding of my new life, beam by beam. He never pushed. Never pried. Just asked good questions and remembered the answers. And that, oddly, made all the difference. One day, he handed me my drink with a folded napkin tucked underneath. On it, a single line. You don't have to be a writer to write. It shouldn't have meant so much. But it did. I began to look forward to our exchanges. Not in the electric, heart-racing way I'd once experienced. This was different. Softer. Like a breeze through an open window instead of a storm. And maybe that's how healing love enters. Quietly, respectfully, not demanding space but offering it. He never asked about my past. I never offered it. There was an unspoken understanding between us. Some stories need to rest before they're told. One Sunday, he invited me to a poetry reading. It was at a local library, dimly lit, full of mismatched chairs and nervous readers clutching crumpled pages. I almost said no. Crowds made me anxious. Vulnerability even more so. But I went, and I'm glad I did. There was something sacred in watching people stand up and speak truth into a room full of strangers. It wasn't about perfection. It was about courage. Afterward, we walked under a canopy of string lights strung between trees, our footsteps in sync but unintentional. He didn't try to hold my hand. He didn't ask me to stay. He just said, "Pooh, you should share your words sometime." I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of him, but because of the way he'd said your words. Like they mattered, like they were worth being heard. I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone had looked at me like that. Not as a project. Not as someone to rescue or romance or reshape, just as a person with stories inside her. A few weeks later, I read at the same open mic. My hands trembled. My voice shook, but I read. About leaving. About silence. About rebuilding from rubble. When I finished, there was a quiet pause before the applause. Not because the words were brilliant, but because they were honest. And that was enough. Oliver clapped louder than anyone. He didn't say anything afterward. He didn't need to. We grew close. But carefully, like gardeners tending to new shoots. No grand declarations, no rushed intimacy. Just small rituals. Coffee, late-night texts about random thoughts, quiet walks after closing shifts. I told him about the bookstore, about my plant, about the photo I kept in the drawer but no longer needed to look at. And one night, I told him about the letters. Not in detail, just enough. He listened, didn't flinch, didn't offer advice or analysis, just held the moment gently, like something sacred. "You're allowed to have loved him," he said, "and still move forward." It felt like permission. But even as I let new moments fill the spaces that once echoed with memory, I never pretended that the past didn't matter. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means weaving the pain in the tapestry of who you are without letting it dictate the pattern. And I was finally doing that. Not perfectly, not all at once, but honestly. One evening, as summer waned and the leaves began to hint at gold, I returned to the apartment I had once shared with him. I hadn't planned to. I was walking home from work, and something pulled me toward that street, toward that building. I stood outside, looking up at the window that used to be mine, and wondered who lived there now. If they kept plants on the sill, if they left notes for each other, if they argued over what to watch or danced in the kitchen or shared coffee each morning. I didn't feel regret, just closure. He had been part of my story, a chapter written in love and ended in truth. And now I was in a new chapter, one where I didn't need to be anyone but myself, one where I could wake up alone and not feel lonely, one where every day wasn't about recovering from something but discovering something. I turned away and walked home. My home, the one I had built piece by piece, choice by choice. That night, I wrote another entry in my notebook. Not about him, not about Oliver, just about me, about the way healing feels like both breaking and blooming, about the way love, true love, sometimes means letting go, not to forget but to grow. And I realized then that maybe love wasn't about finding someone to complete you. Maybe it was about finding someone who reminded you you were already whole. Or better yet, remembering that on your own. Autumn came like a whispered promise, cooler air curling around my ankles each morning. The scent of fading leaves and distant smoke hanging just long enough to make me linger at the window. The city shifted too. Quieter somehow, more introspective. I noticed the way people began to move slower, wrapped in scarves and thoughts, as if the season pulled us all inward. And for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't dread that introspection. It didn't feel like loneliness anymore. It felt like presence, like stillness earned. Oliver and I never defined what we were. That used to terrify me. I had always clung to labels, to structure, to things that could be named and controlled. But there was something freeing about not fitting into a box. We were what we were, fluid, honest, unhurried. He never asked for more than I could give, and I never gave more than I had. And yet, in that delicate balance, we built something quiet and meaningful. We weren't chasing passion or fireworks. We were nurturing something softer, respect, space, consistency. He began to leave poems in my mailbox. Not his own, always someone else's, folded carefully with a notic thought of you. Neruda, Rupi Kaur, Ocean Vuong. The words were never about love in the traditional sense. They were about becoming. About endings that weren't really endings. About the beauty and longing. I kept them all in the same wooden box that once held the letters from a different life. At first, it felt strange, mixing remnants of two stories. But eventually it felt right. Both had shaped me. Both deserved to be remembered. Work at the bookstore remained constant, a quiet rhythm that anchored my weeks. The regulars began to learn my name. A little girl named June would run in every Saturday and ask for the book lady who gave the best stickers. Elderly men would linger in the history aisle, hoping to debate obscure wars. And sometimes a young couple would browse hand in hand, eyes glowing with that new kind of love. And I'd smile, not wistfully, but kindly. I no longer envied them. I knew what that stage was. I also knew what came after. And I didn't resent either. In late October, I got a call I never expected. It was his mother. I hadn't spoken to her since the breakup. We had never been close, not really, but she had always been kind in the way reserved women often are. Polite, warm, distant. Her voice on the phone was slow, trembling slightly. She told me he was in the hospital. Nothing dire. An accident. A broken wrist and some bruised ribs from a bike fall. She was calling, she said, because he had asked for me. Just once. And then didn't mention it again. I didn't know what to do with that information. My first instinct was to pretend I hadn't heard. To let it dissolve into the noise of my day. But I couldn't. Not because I still loved him, not in the way I had. But because love, once real, doesn't vanish. It just changes shape. And I owed it to myself, and maybe to him, to honor that. I didn't tell Oliver. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I didn't want to turn it into a conversation I wasn't ready for. I just said I had to visit someone. He nodded, trusting, and kissed my cheek. That's all. The hospital was sterile and gray like most are. I found his room easily. He was asleep when I arrived, a dull monitor beeping beside him. The kind of silence that feels louder than words. He looked the same, maybe a little thinner, maybe not. Time plays tricks like that. I sat in the chair beside him and watched the slow rise and fall of his chest. I didn't feel the urge to cry or touch him. I just needed to see him with my own eyes, to confirm that the person I once loved was still human, still fallible, still here. After a while, he stirred. His eyes opened slowly, and when he saw me, he didn't look surprised, just tired. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I almost didn't," I replied, truthfully. There was no anger between us, no unfinished fight, just a space filled with things we didn't need to say anymore. He asked how I'd been. I told him, in generalities. He didn't ask about anyone else in my life, and I didn't ask about his. We spoke for 20 minutes, not about us, just about now, the weather, work, books, life, and then I stood to leave. He didn't try to stop me, didn't ask to see me again. But just before I reached the door, he said, "I'm glad you smiled again." I turned and gave him one more. Not for nostalgia, but for closure. I walked out of that hospital lighter than I walked in. I wasn't shaken or confused. I didn't spiral into memory. I just felt peaceful. Some chapters need an epilogue. That was ours, and I was grateful for it. When I returned home, Oliver was waiting on the steps with 2 cups of hot cider. He didn't ask questions, just handed me a cup and sat beside me. The sun was setting, sky streaked with gold and indigo. I leaned into him, not because I needed comfort, but because I wanted to share the moment. "You okay?" he asked gently. "I am," I said. "I really am." In the weeks that followed, I found myself writing more, pages and pages. Not about heartbreak, but about healing, about identity, about what it means to leave, and more importantly, what it means to return to yourself. I wrote about the version of me that had forgotten how to laugh, and the version that now danced barefoot in the kitchen again, this time alone, this time free. Winter came with its own kind of poetry, snow settling on rooftops, the hush of cold mornings, the way breath curled in the air like something visible, tangible. I began reading my writing aloud at open mics more often. Each time, I felt less like an imposter, more like someone reclaiming her voice. Oliver was there for most of them, sitting in the back, always clapping first. Sometimes he'd bring friends. Sometimes he'd bring flowers. Always, he brought calm. And slowly, I allowed myself to trust him. Not with everything, but with enough. One evening, he invited me to a family dinner. I hesitated. It felt like a step towards something I wasn't sure I was ready for. But then I remembered how long I had lived my life waiting to feel ready, only to realize that healing doesn't wait for permission. So I went. His family was loud and chaotic in the best way, passing dishes across the table, teasing each other, sharing stories with mismatched timelines. His niece spilled juice on my lap within the first 10 minutes, and his mother asked if I wanted wine or whiskey before asking my name. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was real, and I felt at home. Afterward, as we walked back to his apartment, I said, "They're lovely." He grinned. "They like you." I paused, then added, "I like me too, when I'm with them." That made him stop. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "That's all I want. For you to like you." We didn't say, "I love you," that night. We didn't need to. Love was there, not in the words, but in the presence, in the way he held my hand, not tightly, but with reverence, in the way he gave me space without making me feel distant, in the way he never tried to fix me, only witnessed me, fully and without expectation. That winter, we spent New Year's Eve on the rooftop of his building, bundled in blankets, watching fireworks erupt across the city skyline. At midnight, he kissed me gently and whispered, "To new chapters." And I thought, yes, to all the pages I'm finally ready to write. The new year unfolded not with loud declarations or dramatic resolutions, but with a gentle certainty, like a soft snow that accumulates quietly through the night and only makes itself known by morning. January became a month of quiet rituals, morning tea instead of coffee, long walks without a destination, writing each night before sleep. I felt no pressure to become someone new. I just wanted to inhabit myself more fully, to live each day with more honesty, more presence. There was peace in simplicity, and I guarded it fiercely. Oliver continued to be part of my life, not as a savior, not as a replacement, but as a companion walking beside me in a shared but unforced rhythm. We didn't rush into anything. There were no keys exchanged, no talk of kuss in definitive terms. And yet, there was something more intimate in the way he handed me a scarf without asking if I was cold, or in the way he remembered the titles of my favorite books without writing them down. He paid attention, and not in the performative way some people do to be praised, but in a quiet, sincere way that made me feel seen. I wrote constantly during those early months. Some nights it poured out of me like an open floodgate, other times I sat for hours and only managed a single sentence. But I never forced it. I had learned the cost of forcing things, not just with writing, but with people, with myself, with love. There's a price to be paid for twisting yourself to fit into a story that's outgrown you. I wasn't interested in bending anymore. I was learning to stand. I began submitting pieces to small literary journals, not because I sought acclaim or validation, but because I wanted my voice to exist somewhere outside my notebooks. I wanted it to live beyond me, to maybe find someone, somewhere, who needed the words I once needed myself. Rejections came, of course. Polite, form letter rejections that used phrases like, "not the right fit at this time." But then, one morning in February, I got an email that simply read, "We would love to publish your essay in our spring issue." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I did. I forwarded the email to Oliver without a word. He replied with a photo of a cake he bought and captioned it, "A celebratory sugar mandatory." It made me laugh, and then it made me cry. That weekend, we ate the entire cake in our pajamas on his kitchen floor, and that was the moment I realized I wasn't scared anymore. Not of love, not of leaving, not of being left. I was no longer trying to protect myself from the past. I had carried it long enough. It had shaped me, but it didn't own me. The woman who left the apartment a year ago was still inside me, bruised, cautious, longing. But she had made room for someone else, someone who smiled without checking first to see if it was safe. But healing is not a straight line. March arrived like an old bruise. Unexpected, a little sore when touched. It started with a message on social media. I hadn't blocked him. I had simply unfollowed, silenced, stepped away. We lived in different orbits now. But that message landed like a stone on calm water. Just 3 words, "I saw you," no context, no punctuation. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't respond, but for the first time in months, I couldn't write that night. The next morning, another message, "You looked happy." This one stung more, not because it was cruel, but because it implied observation, distance, still watching, still holding on in some quiet, invisible way. I wanted to believe it was harmless, nostalgic, maybe even kind, but it felt like a tether, one I had long since cut, now reappearing as if summoned by memory alone. I told Oliver. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. He didn't react with jealousy or insecurity. He simply listened, then asked, "Do you feel okay?" And I did, nervous, but okay. "I won't reply," I said. "I don't think I owe him that anymore." He nodded. "You don't?" It should have ended there, but the past rarely lets go cleanly. 2 weeks later, I ran into him. Not in a bookstore, not in a place that meant something. Just on the street, near the train station, where chance meetings are more jarring than poetic. He was wearing the coat I once gave him, the one with the torn inside pocket and the stitched up hem. Our eyes met. He smiled first. I didn't. We exchanged pleasantries, surface level, brittle. "I read your piece," he said. I blinked. "How?" He shrugged. It made its way to me. I didn't ask what he thought. I didn't care. "You were always meant to write," he added. I was just too distracted to see it back then. The words were meant as praise. I knew that, but they felt like excavation, digging into an old version of myself I had worked hard to bury. "I hope you're doing well," I said, and I meant it. He nodded, eyes softer than I remembered. "I am, finally." And then, before either of us could add something that would linger too long, I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. That night, I wrote again, not about him, but about freedom, about the strange way closure comes not with grand gestures, but with the quiet relief of disinterest. Spring returned slowly. The bookstore put out flower boxes again. Customers came in with lighter jackets and stories about travel plans. June, the little girl, gave me a daisy she'd picked from the park. I pressed it in my notebook next to the poem I wrote the day after I left him, the one that simply read, "I am still here." Still soft, still standing. Oliver and I went on a trip in April, just a weekend, a cabin near the lake, no Wi-Fi, no expectations, just us and a stack of books and the sound of water. We cooked together, read aloud, took naps without guilt. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, safe, joyful, rooted. One morning, I caught him staring at me while I was brushing my teeth. I asked what he was thinking. He said, "That you're not afraid anymore." I paused, toothbrush in hand, then smiled. "No, I'm not." That night, by the fire, he asked if I wanted to move in with him. There was no pressure in the question, just an offering. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was unsure, but because I had promised myself I'd never say a yes to anything that felt like erasure. And I needed to know that moving in wouldn't mean blending into someone else's life again. I needed to be certain that I could still be myself, messy, introspective, independent, and still be loved. Only if we can keep our separate bookshelves. I joked. He laughed. Deal. We returned to the city the next day. I packed slowly, carefully. Not because I was scared, but because this time I knew what it meant to share a space, a rhythm, a life. And I was ready. I brought my plants, my notebooks, my tiny lamp I couldn't sleep without. I didn't abandon my apartment. I let it go. With gratitude. The first night in our shared space, I unpacked the wooden box. He watched as I pulled out the letters, the poems, the daisy. I looked at him. "This is part of my story. I don't want to hide it." He kissed my forehead. "Then we'll give it a shelf." And so we did. A tiny corner of our new home, not for the past, but for the pieces of it that shaped the present. Love, I had learned, wasn't about rewriting yourself to fit someone else's story. It was about writing together, with honesty, with respect, with room for both histories and hopes. And for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer surviving. I was living. Finally. And the story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. Summer returned not with fanfare, but with long, golden hours that stretched lazily into the evening and reminded me how far I'd come. A year ago, I was standing in the ruins of a love that had quietly collapsed beneath the weight of unspoken words and unresolved grief. Now, I stood in the light of something new. Not perfect, not effortless, but deeply, consciously chosen. Our shared apartment was small, sunlit, full of mismatched furniture and overlapping lives. The walls bore no secrets. Our silences weren't heavy anymore, they were restful. And that, I realized, was what safety really meant. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of truth. Oliver and I had carved out a rhythm, one we didn't force. Some nights, we cooked together. Other nights, we ordered takeout and ate on the floor in front of old films. He kept using my shampoo. I kept stealing his socks. We'd argue over music. He liked jazz at A&M, I preferred quiet, but always laughed before it turned into anything more. I was still writing, more than ever now. The words came easier, like they trusted me again. I published 2 more essays in small journals, and people began to reach out. Not critics, not editors, just strangers, readers. Women mostly. Some said they cried. Others said thank you. One simply wrote, "You made me leave." I understood what she meant. I didn't reply. I just pressed my palm to the screen for a moment and whispered, "You're brave." But one evening, as I was organizing a pile of books in our bedroom, I came across the old wooden box. It had lived quietly on a shelf, untouched since I moved in. I opened it, not out of nostalgia, but as an act of acknowledgement. The letters were still there, fragile but intact. The poems from Oliver, the daisy from June, now dry and delicate. I read none of them, just held them, one by one, and allowed the past to feel less like a wound and more like a layer, something beneath the surface that no longer defined me. I closed the box, not with finality, but with peace. And for the first time, I considered letting it go. Not to erase anything, but to make room. Life wasn't a novel. It didn't move in perfect arcs or poetic symbolism. It moved in circles and spirals and moments. Some days were full of light, others felt gray. But even the gray held clarity. I no longer panicked in stillness. I didn't need noise to feel alive. I began to say no more often. To obligations, to people who drained me, to the quiet voice in my head that still whispered I was too much or not enough. I took longer baths. I bought flowers for no reason. I learned how to make risotto, finally, without burning the bottom. I reconnected with friends I'd lost during the quiet decay of my old life. Some came back. Others didn't. I let that be okay. Oliver asked me to come with him to visit his hometown in July, a small coastal village 3 hours away. I hesitated, not because I was afraid of the place, but because I was afraid of being seen in a new way, through the eyes of the people who had shaped him. I didn't want to be defined by what I wasn't. But when we arrived, I was met not with questions, but stories. His father taught me how to sail. His mother told me how he used to build forts in the backyard and leave notes for his imaginary army. I saw him differently after that. Not better, just deeper. And he saw me too. One afternoon, sitting on a weathered dock with our feet in the water, he said quietly, "I think we found each other because we weren't looking to be saved, just met." It undid me, in the best way. We stayed there a week. I wrote each morning before breakfast. He swam. We barely checked our phones. On the last night, under stars brighter than I'd seen in years, he handed me a small journal, leather-bound, simple. "For your next story," he said. I opened it. Inside, on the first page, were the words, "You." Unfiltered, no metaphors, just you. I cried then, not because I was sad, but because I was ready. For all of it. Back in the city, life resumed its pace. Summer unfolded with rooftop dinners, market flowers, the hum of fans in windows. Oliver and I talked more about the future. Not in blueprints or timelines, but in possibilities. He wanted to open a small cafe someday. I wanted to teach writing, maybe lead workshops for women learning to reclaim their voices. We didn't make promises. We made space. There was something profoundly sacred in that. One afternoon, I received a message that changed everything. It was from a publisher. They'd read my most recent piece. They asked if I had ever considered writing a book. I stared at the email for 10 minutes before replying. Then another 10 before calling Oliver. "You're going to do it," he said. "I'm terrified," I confessed. He smiled. "Good. Means it matters." And it did. The process wasn't linear. Writing never is. Some days I sat in front of the screen for hours, paralyzed by the pressure of telling the truth without turning it into performance. Other days, the words came in floods, like the story had been waiting patiently for me to catch up. I didn't write about him, not directly, but he was there, in the spaces, in the silences, in the girl who stayed too long, in the woman who finally left, in the questions we're all too afraid to ask ourselves. As the manuscript neared completion, I began to feel something I hadn't expected: grief. Not for the past, but for the self I was shedding once more. Growth always costs something: comfort, familiarity, versions of ourselves that feel safer, even if smaller. I mourned the girl who once believed love meant staying, even when it hurt. I mourned the woman who walked away without knowing if she'd survive it. And I thanked them both. The book came out quietly. No bestseller lists, no press tours. Just a cover I loved, a spine that bore my name, and a story that felt like a release. Oliver took me to dinner the night it launched. A small table near the window, candlelight, no speeches, just us. He raised his glass. To the girl who left, and the woman who wrote her way back. I couldn't speak for a moment. Then, with tears in my eyes, I added, to the man who met me there. We didn't get engaged that night. We didn't move to a bigger apartment. We didn't post about the book. But we held hands on the walk home like it was the only thing that mattered. Because, in that moment, it was. Months passed. Life stayed messy, full, real. There were disagreements, mismatched schedules, moments of doubt. But there was also louder. Stability. A home that felt like breath. And then, one morning, I woke up early and walked to the edge of the bed. I looked out at the light pouring in, at the shelves filled with both our books, at the plant that still hadn't died, and I knew something I hadn't dared believe before. I was whole. Not because of him, not in spite of him, but because I had stopped abandoning myself. That morning, I wrote the final sentence of my second book. It wasn't about heartbreak. It wasn't about healing. It was about becoming. About how sometimes the bravest thing we ever do is choose ourselves without apology. And how, if we're lucky, someone beautiful meets us on the other side. Not to complete us, but to walk beside us, hand in hand as we write the next chapter together. Not the end, just a new beginning. Enjoyed the video? Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss an update.